Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Ever wonder how a public figure navigated the life issues from the late 1960s and early 70s through the end of her public life in 1989? Was her faith shaken by public pressure and by the dominant liberal media? Did her political career take a hit because she was pro-life and pro-woman? And what does our guest think of the current edict from Obama's Health and Human Service Secretary Kathleen Sebelius to force religious institutions to hand out contraceptives, sterilization, and abortifacients in direct contradiction to their moral beliefs and teachings? Our guest today will give her thoughts on her career and these important issues. Today's guest was born in Flushing, New York in 1931. Her collegiate studies took her to the University of Leiden in Holland in 1952. She received a BA from Albertus Magnus College in 1953. She then graduated from Boston College Law School in 1956. She served 8 terms in the United States House of Representatives from 1967 to 1983, representing the Massachusetts 10th Congressional District. She also served as Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Reagan administration from 1983 to 1985. In December of '85, she became the ambassador to Ireland all the way until 1989. Well, welcome, Ambassador Margaret Heckler.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, nice to hear your voice, too. Can you tell us, Margaret, back in the late 60s, early 70s, did you consider yourself pro-life or pro-woman, or what was the atmosphere like back at that time?
Well, I think we are all conditioned by our experiences in life. And when I became the Speaker of the House of the Student Legislature during my college years at Albertus Magnus, the Student Legislature of Connecticut, I developed an interest in democracy and government, and thought that I would like to go into government at some point, but wanted to be a lawyer. It so happened that I was the only girl in my law school class at BC, graduating in 1953.
Wow.
So that in that situation, I immediately started to look for a job in Boston, a wonderful place and wonderful city. Unfortunately, not too friendly to women lawyers at that time. And I think that experience very much influenced my attitude toward women. But I also am a natural-born Catholic with a great love of God, having gone to many Catholic schools, all Catholic education, and I did not see a conflict in this. I supported the Lord, first of all, in my whole life, and I thank Him to this day for all that He's done for me. But I also believed in the advancement of women and fairness and justice to women. And so I was always committed to the sanctity of life, always voted that way. In fact, one of the first bills I ever introduced as a new Congresswoman was a bill to protect the right of conscience of hospital and medical workers, exactly the issue that's the problem today. In my era, in 1967, 68, it was not even difficult to get that bill passed. It did pass without too much controversy at all. But today, it's highly controversial. But my position was unalterable because I deeply believe in what I had been taught and what I saw around me. I believe that life is the most precious gift that God gives to mankind. And so, therefore, I always pursued a position in public office that supported, I felt, the Creator's choice. But at the same time, I always worked to advance women's rights. And, in fact, I was one of the founders of the Congresswoman's Caucus. But at that point, we did not vote on abortion. I ruled that out. But there are so many issues. I was particularly interested in the economic issues, which even to this day affect women in a very special way. Was it a political liability? Yes. I lost some very important people early on. I lost one of my treasurers in one of my early campaigns. And in the last campaign, in which I was experiencing the third redistricting, and Massachusetts was losing a congressional seat, I was placed in the same district with Barney Frank, and it was a much more liberal district than I had previously represented. And the issue of women's rights, as they saw it, and it was defined as women's choice, of whether or not to have an abortion. That was a negative factor, but there were other negative factors. It was a year of a downturn in the economy, not good for me. And with the redistricting, I was in a much harder situation, and in fact lost that election. But as is often said, God never closes a door, but he opens a window. And he opened a beautiful window for me. I became Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I think God inspired that decision, but it was Ronald Reagan who really opened the door for me. And I was very honored and privileged to serve again in public office at an even higher rank, and then as ambassador as well. So I've been very blessed.
Now, let me ask you a couple of questions. Were you for or against? Wasn't there a human life amendment to the Constitution back when you were in Congress? Were you for that or against it?
Yes, I was for it.
You were for it?
Yes.
I see. Okay. And did Barney Frank, did he grab the now vote from you?
Yes, he did.
The pro-choice vote when he...
Oh, yes, he did, very substantially. And that was disappointing to me because I had worked for the advancement of women, as I said, in so many areas. In fact, I was the author of the Women's Credit Bill, which gave women the right to credit in their own name, which barred discrimination in the granting of home mortgages based on sex or marital status. And in my era, in those dark ages, which I think many women listening to this today would not believe ever existed, but they did. Women could not get credit, any credit, in their own name. They very often used their deceased husband's credit cards because there was no way to get your own credit in your name. And I was the leader of that fight, and it was my bill that passed, and I'm very proud of that because I think it opened the door for many women. Now, women today, and I'm one of them, we're all bombarded with requests for opening credit accounts in different banks and different financial institutions. There's not a problem, but the argument in my day was women would not pay their bills. That's what I was told in the Banking Committee of the Congress. Well, that wasn't true. They've learned differently. But it was disappointing that so many of the women who knew what I had done and had walked with me in marches and made statements at the same time, women in the military and women in virtually every area, were not supportive. But it was to be expected. I mean, I never decided my votes based upon my electability. Of course, that was one thing that we had in mind. But when you go to something that's your basic and most important personal, ethical, and spiritual right to have your thoughts, I always saw the issue of life as being God's gift, and that in general, I look at, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother now, and I look upon all the gifts of my life and the political offices I've held, which each has been very special in every way, but my children, my grandchildren, are the greatest gift, and I still remain very, very committed to the fact that really the life is the most important thing to protect at all ages of life. And I think it's vital. It's the most essential right that we have received, the gift of life, very precious. When one life is taken away, we know the loss in personal and human terms. However, when the lives of thousands and millions of babies are denied, it is not only the personal loss, it's a national loss. How many babies, how many brilliant people have we lost in our own country because of abortion?
Yes, we've lost at least to 54 million.
54 million. And who were the artists and who were the leaders, who were the special people in our lives, in our families, who could have made a great contribution that we have just tossed aside as if they were of just irrelevant value, when in fact they were human lives, and human life is special.
Well, now let me ask you, when you were in charge of Health and Human Services under the Reagan administration, were you dealing with issues like contraception, abortifacients, and that sort of a thing?
Not really. I in fact did promote the use of natural birth control, and in fact I gave a grant to the country of Egypt at the request of the government of Egypt, to teach the Egyptian women how natural childbirth can be promoted and natural family planning. It's a marvelous system. In fact, all of the physicians who deal with infertility all across America use natural family planning as one of the ways of overcoming infertility. And this was a very important way to avoid abortion and promote life. I was very greatly honored by the government of Egypt. They sent planes for me to take me to all of the Valley of the Kings and the Queens and all of the holy sites in Egypt and some of the most brilliant locations, brilliant and beautiful locations in Egypt. It was a very special trip, beginning in Israel and then going to Egypt. But, and they were anxious, very anxious and hungry for the natural family planning strategy, which we were happy to share. That was the most important issue in terms of the protection of life that I was involved with. Abortion was always an issue, but it was more an issue in the Congress. I must have voted on the issue of abortion about 200 times or more, but it was a congressional issue. When I got to the Department of H.H.S., it was already being decided by the Congress, and Roe v. Wade had occurred during those years of my service in Congress.
I see. And I remember I was at Georgetown at the time. I was a freshman at Georgetown University, and that particular weekend, Lyndon Baines Johnson had passed away, and then the following Monday they came out with the Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton decision. Do you remember that being the big news, or was it the Lyndon Baines Johnson death and subsequent funeral? Well,
it depends on what you were looking for, but the president's death was a very major event. For many, many people who were ardently in favor of Roe v. Wade, they were jubilant, and that was the biggest issue to them. I really was not actually expecting it. I did not expect the court to make that decision. I've always favored the other side, and I still do.
Mm-hmm. And now, moving forward all the way to just the past month or so, we've had the current Obama Health and Human Services Secretary, Kathleen Sebelius, put forth an edict requiring religious institutions to provide free of charge abortifacients, sterilizations, and contraception. What do you think of that?
Oh, I'm absolutely shocked by this. I never expected that decision. Now, as I said earlier, there was a premonition of that kind of a decision. It was discussed earlier, and it was in that earlier environment that I introduced a bill that would protect the freedom of conscience of medical workers, nurses, and doctors to follow their own conscience and not be required to perform abortions, for example. But I did not expect an edict from the government and from my own department of H.H.S. I don't know how, within the family of President Obama, how Secretary Sebelius actually felt about this. I was told by someone who said that she and Vice President Biden had not voted for that in their own inner sanctum. I hope not. But she is enforcing it. And I feel the issue there is not women's rights. I think the issue is the Constitution itself, because freedom of religion was one of the basic rights in which the United States was founded. And it was the cause of the immigration to this new land, to America, so that one's free spirit of worshiping God, and there was a spirit of worship of God that's much greater than it is today, in many different religions in many different countries, that this spirit would be freely exercised. And when the right to follow one's own deeply held religious beliefs is denied by the government, by the enforcement of an edict which forces the medical personnel to comply and perform deeply, in their view, evil procedures, under many circumstances, it's a denial of the religious rights of the Constitution, guaranteed by the Constitution itself. And I think this affects every man, woman, and child. And as Governor Mike Huckabee said on national TV on his television program, we are all Catholics today, meaning that he, as a former Protestant minister and pastor, was fighting with the same position that the Catholic Church holds on freedom of religion. He saw the value of this. This is an issue that destroys the basic framework of America. It is an invasion of our constitutional rights of the greatest magnitude. And I feel that in every case, this has to be protected, and I think it's up to us, all citizens, to speak out and to see this issue in that light. There are ramifications for women, but there are ramifications for everyone. And if we lose our basic freedoms, such as the right to worship and hold our beliefs and be free to practice our faith as we wish, we are destroying the core of America.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that that if Obamacare is overturned by the United States Supreme Court and they've heard the case, we're waiting for the decision, would that nullify Kathleen Sebelius' edict that came down a month ago?
Well, there are many other factors in the decision, as you know, the court's decision. I think it would be. It's another factor that makes us turn to the Constitution, but and in that sense, the protection of constitutional rights would be embraced in the decision by the court. However, the specifics in that Obamacare it is such a vast bill, thousands and thousands of pages, 27,000 pages. I don't think any one act by the court could be the complete, conclusive determination of the issue. I think that the courts, it would be very, very powerful, and how it would be interpreted would remain to be seen. But it would have an impact, a great impact on the whole law. But I frankly am not happy with this law. It's the old philosophy of the end justifies the means. I think the president has a concern for the poor, for including everyone in health care, and that would justify the means of allowing all of the other decisions in the Obamacare legislation, which are very threatening to life as well. The number of it will be a data-driven system in which the doctor-patient relationship will be cast aside, and the determination of health care at a very personal level will be made by councils and review organizations far removed from any direct human being connection. And I think that there are so many questions in that law. I think it is seriously flawed. I do like the idea of universal health care, but I don't believe that this is the way to achieve it. And I think that in the process of the means that they've determined, which is a very governmentally, regulatory, structured operation that really is devoid of the human connection, doctor-patient relationship, and I think it is more of a denial of the human rights of the patient than we've ever seen in government. I don't think that's the intention. I think their intentions are good, but I think that the end that they chose, the strategy that they proposed, is fatally flawed. I hope it will be overturned.
I see. I know that the bill is over 2,700 pages long, and it goes in front of something called the Independent Pay Advisory Board, which is going to be making the decisions.
One of the many advisory boards. The bill is really composed of a large number of independent groups and councils who will be reviewing the data, the information about healthcare practices across the country, and will become a numbers game. And in those numbers, and even today, as you look at the decision about Vice President Cheney's heart transplant, which I am grateful for because the man is still a contributor to government. He waited for 2 years before his name was called to receive a heart transplant, and he still has a great deal to give. But the whole discussion is very reflective of the hard decisions of our society. Well, the Obamacare decisions would leave all of those not to the individual doctors, but to the councils, the government sponsored and appointed councils of people who are totally anonymous, unknown, probably very knowledgeable in their fields, but nonetheless devoid of that relationship to the citizenry, to the people, that allows the freedom of health care and good health care to be exercised on something more than the paper process of the data collection.
And what about the whole aspect of fining people or taxing people with Obamacare?
Well, we've seen today the IRS is going to receive an enormous injection of billions and billions of dollars, something over $3 billion, I think. And I just heard this as I drove on the radio, so I'm not going to be pinned down to the exactness, but millions of dollars and billions, I think. The IRS agents are the enforcers of the law, so that in the very first few years, an individual who chose not to be insured could pay a fine, and in the first few years, the fines are very low. But in the third or fourth year, the fines become as expensive as health care, and therefore they are brought into health care. If they do not pay what will become much higher fines, then the IRS will be enforcing a revenue law, just as they do anything else. And that means that everyone under the health care system who has not paid the premium that is required will receive their dear letter from the IRS reminding them, and that is a very intimidating manner in which to enforce the health care law. But that's exactly what will happen. Thousands of new IRS agents will be signed into law and will be hired by the government. They will dutifully carry out their responsibilities, and the taxes, which start very low and become much, much higher, are going to become the subject of their main criteria. So instead of worrying about your income tax on April 15th as coming around the corner, you'll be worrying about the IRS letter you have on your health care tax. And this whole system is heavily regulatory, and the enforcement mechanism through the IRS is it will be a very difficult process for the voters, and will certainly remove the savings that were predicted for this. In fact, I see very few savings here because almost all the projected costs of Obamacare have been lower than they needed to be, and they are disproved by more recent facts and figures and recent investigations. So the system itself is less than, you cannot include millions of new voters and new patients into the healthcare system, and at the same time not increase the cost for the average taxpayer who participates. And how this will be worked out will be one of the factors that will be discussed after the Supreme Court acts. But how you can include, maximize, and expand service by a very large factor without increasing costs. The only way you can do it is by decreasing the services to those who are already receiving them. And so these are factors, and the enforcement factor through the IRS, I think, is going to be one of the more undesirable features of the law. I think it's under attack, but we'll have to see how the election goes.
I see. And Margaret, one final question as our time gets close to an end is, do you have the capability to discuss, as being a former Health and Human Services Secretary, are you able to pick up the phone and call Kathleen Sebelius and talk to her about conscience aspects of the edict that she put forward? Is that something that would be that you could do? I don't know.
Well, I think that I have met her, and she was extremely cordial. She's a very knowledgeable woman, has had marvelous public service. We do differ on the right to life issue very strongly, but I have considered talking to her, but I think it would be very difficult to do that. I'm sure the issue has been fully explored with her and that her decision was she is supporting her president, and I think this is largely the president's decision that she's enforcing.
I see. Well, Ambassador Heckler, thank you so much for being on the show today, and we'll have to have you on again sometime, perhaps when you're up this way in Boston. It would be wonderful if you were.
Okay, great.
We hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. We believe people who are elected to public office need to fight for America's most fundamental right, the right to life, from fertilization to natural death. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.